This is House Planning Help, episode 142. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Alongside this, my personal goal is still to create an energy-efficient home. Originally, I wanted to do this before I turned 40. That's about to happen very soon. And in this session, my guest is Marine Sanchez from Enhabit. We're going to be concluding our mini-series on various professions. Today, looking at the role of Passivhaus Designer. We've also spoken to a quantity surveyor and a structural engineer. So we'll do another run of this because it's quite good, looking at various professions and just trying to understand more about what these people do, how they might fit into our team, and so on. A quick look behind the scenes of what we're doing here at House Planning Help. This is something that I'm keen to get up and running that I thought I'd share with you at this stage. It's regular in-person meetups. The reason regular, because I think if you know it's coming up every month, and perhaps let's say it would be at the beginning of the month, probably at a regular location to begin with as well in London, then you're more likely to engage when you can or try and fit it into your calendar. It's aimed at you if you're someone looking to build a house, then energy efficient home, you know all of that. Like me, you're on that path either ahead or behind, but just wanting to catch up, meet other people doing a similar thing, share your woes, share your wins, whatever it might be. We'll maybe have a presentation or a guest speaker, someone who's been there and done it. So we walk out of this, hopefully all having learnt something, having made some connections, just really, really useful. So houseplanninghelp.com/events is where it will be. And that I'm giving you that URL because whenever we have an event, we'll post it up on that calendar, houseplanninghelp.com/events. Let's get to our featured interview, as I mentioned, with Marine Sanchez from Enhabit. And she's someone that I've known for a while. I meet her from time to time. I can tell she's really passionate. She's certainly well respected. I remember going to one of the conferences where she gave a presentation. I just thought, wow, this is probably for me the presentation of the whole conference. Really, really good. And just waiting for the right opportunity to bring her on here, because we often talk about Passivhaus and I don't want you to get bored of it. However, I think this fits perfectly because not only is she a certified Passivhaus designer, she also helps train people as they want to become a certified Passivhaus designer. So let's get into this. I started by asking Marine how she came to work in high performance construction.
That goes back to university, more or less. So I studied general engineering in France and then realized that I wanted to do something with the environment, with engineering and sustainability. And that's where I found something around sustainable buildings. Went to Oxford Brookes to get a master in sustainable buildings and then started working. Regarding Passivhaus, I started working in the real world and the buildings were not delivering how they were supposed to. And at university, everything was working so well. So I was like, hang on a minute, there's, something in there that doesn't quite work. And so studied and understood a bit more about the performance gap, meaning that buildings don't deliver the way they're supposed to. And Passivhaus was one of the answers. So that's where I started digging a bit deeper and go down that route.
When did you become a Passivhaus designer?
4 years ago, I think. 4 years ago, yeah.
And why did you want to be one? What does that help you do?
That's a tough question. So it gives you this extra knowledge, and the Passivhaus training to get to the accreditation of being a Passivhaus designer really goes back to basic. It's not about understanding a software or something like that. It's understanding the physics of how a building works. So really going back to scratch makes you, gives you really solid knowledge and probably makes you a better designer.
So is it about going on a course that shows that you've understood all these concepts?
Yes, the certification is about, understanding all the concept. So the first step is obviously to do the course and take the test, which gives you the title of Certified Passivhaus Designer. But the second step is then the experience, indeed. So then you have to put that into practice and probably get a bit of help on the few first project until this becomes like a kind of routine and it all goes okay.
What's the time scale and how does it work? Could I do the certified Passivhaus designer course, or do you really need to be at a certain level to make it happen? I'm not going to do it, don't worry.
Well, so actually the course tends to last for about 2 weeks. So 2 chunk of 1 week. So this is quite an intense training, but I'm actually Passivhaus trainer on one of his courses, so I can tell you a bit more. we get quite a wide range of people. We get quite a lot of architects, a few engineers, and it's quite nice because over the last few years, we've started having structural engineers, M&E engineers, and we even had some house owners that wanted to learn a bit more. So that's quite intense for them. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's really interesting. So yeah, anybody can do this, but there is a lot of maths and physics behind it to really understand how a building works.
So you're building on top of a profession, really. This is just another qualification. It wouldn't be you going straight into this, having not done anything in construction before. I know you've said that you've had some cases of that.
Yes, you're right. I think it's a matter of building on top of a profession. And it's quite nice that you don't have to be only an engineer or only an architect to become a passive house designer. So that's the nice thing about it.
Okay, now I need some clarification on, we have passive house designer, passive house architect, passive house consultant. What is the difference between all those?
So there's actually not a lot of differences technically from the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt. There's only 2 qualifications, passive house designer and passive house consultant. And these are almost there is no difference in between that. It's just a matter of what type of degree you had when you were back at university. So people should not pay attention to that. The only thing to remember is in terms of people being having a certification, you have passive house designer / consultant, and that's going to be your building physics engineer or your architect, right? This is the person that does the design. Then you have your passive house certifier. This is the independent person that will review your design and give you, tell you if your building can be certified or not. And then you have passive house tradesperson, who are the people on site that get trained to work really well with low energy buildings. So these are the only kind of 3 differences that people should remember.
How do you work then as a passive house designer? When do you get involved? What's the work you're doing?
It's much better if we get involved from day one, because you've done quite a lot of podcasts already. So you know that if you
Everyone wants to be involved from day one. Yeah, I know.
True. But it makes it easier, because designing a low energy building, no matter its shape, its form and its function, it's quite easy if you know that you want a low energy building from day one, because you can work around it. And the low energy aspect is not going to constrain you. If somebody does a whole design, work quite a few months between an architect and a client, and then come to us as building physics consultant saying, can I then please have this building as a low energy building? Then it costs a lot of money to trying to retrofit the low energy aspects onto a build. So in terms of being a passive house designer, yes, you want to be involved from day one. And your job would be to guide the entire design team, meaning the client, the architect, the structural engineer, the M&E engineer if you have one, and quantity surveyor as well, as to, what type of concepts you want to work towards, right? You want a very efficient fabric and, a few things like this. So trying to guide them during the first stage of feasibility study and things like that. You would probably also do a first PHPP model, PHPP being the Passive House Planning Package, which is the software that you use to design passive house buildings, and give your input during the feasibility stage, and then refine all this input towards exact performance and exact products and specifications for detailed design, before then giving the support that is needed to the team on site if ever they're new to low energy buildings.
So it sounds to me, on the whole, as a client, that I might not necessarily come into contact with you, or would I do, because of this integrated team?
I think you should, because it's important that the client realize what passive house is and what type of impacts it has on everything. Because even if you've got a really good team working together, I feel that the passive house designer has a tiny bit of a strange role in the fact that anything on the design could have an impact on how the building performs. So even if the passive house designer is not an architect and won't do architectural design, is not an M&E engineer and might not do the ventilation and lighting design, any of these aspects could impact on how your building perform. And the passive house designer is the one to promise how the building is going to perform. So you do need this overall view and this very broad understanding of what everybody does in the team. And I think that's why the client should also know that as well.
Are there cases where the architect is actually a passive house designer, or how often is a passive house designer brought in?
Okay, being a passive house designer, you don't have to have a certain profession to get that. So it could be generally either a building physics engineer or an architect. And we do have quite a few cases in the UK where quite a few well-known architects are also passive house designers. In terms of how often you bring a passive house designer in the process, it depends on the client. Some of the clients know that from day one, and we get in from day one and help the team. Some of the clients go down the route of thinking about the building they want to build, but realize about low energy building aspects later on, and we get brought on a bit later in the design.
What happens if we don't use a passive house designer but still want a passive house?
That's a tricky question. Technically, you can. You don't need a passive house designer to get a passive house building. However, having a passive house designer on board, it brings the experience and the knowledge that comes with it. Because if you wanted a passive house building and would go all the way through designing and building this building without people that have done it before, then you would spend all this money and spend all this time and then see at the end if it reaches it. But passive house is, for me, it is very good. It is the end of the scale of what we can at the moment deliver in terms of low energy buildings. And it is a very difficult target. It is doable, but you don't achieve it by chance. And I feel that if you don't have a passive house designer on board, you would be taking a lot of risk to potentially still have an amazing, comfortable, low energy building at the end, but you would probably be just above the target that you need to reach for having your building accredited as a passive house building, and therefore, miss the target that you wanted to have.
Let's say, as a lot of people will still be in this situation, that perhaps someone in the team, an architect, a builder, or so forth, hasn't got the experience. If you have a passive house designer, is that actually going to be enough experience to get you through this, or do you really need one of your key people to have done this before?
If the entire team knows about passive house, obviously it's easier, right? Everybody speaks the same vocabulary, and you don't have to probably explain as much and explain why you don't want thermal bridging or why airtightness is so important. But if you have only one person that knows about passive house in the team, if you just have your passive house designer, it's doable because yes, passive house is a standard, and people want to have this certification. But at the end of the day, we're just working with low energy buildings, and the concept behind it, it's not magic and it's not rocket science. It's literally just paying attention to detail. That's all it's asking. And passive house is a very nice platform to put this team into, like, asking them to pay attention to the details, and that's how you know that your building will deliver what you said it would. So I think just having one passive house designer might make it a bit more time consuming, but it would be a very good learning curve for the entire team. And it's definitely achievable because I've been in this situation quite a lot of times, and it works. It works. And the team, I think, gets better for it because you then kind of spread the love of passive house a bit further, and they go on to the next project, and they're trying to do it again.
We talked a lot about passive house. What happens if we're just trying to make an energy efficient home and it's a bit more woolly? Would we have a reason to incorporate a passive house designer?
I personally think so. Maybe some people might differ, but that's why I'm talking about passive house as a platform. When I say passive house, I mean any low energy buildings, because it's the same solution to achieve any type of standards you want as a low energy building. We work with Passive House, we work with Enhabit, which is Passive House for refurbishment, and we work with ACB Silver, which is slightly more relaxed, but the same type of certification, but now created on a UK basis rather than a German one. And for me, no matter which target you want to achieve, it's still the same solution. It's just paying attention to the details and maybe not pushing as far, but it's still the same concept that you're using. So I would say, yes, you would like to have a building physics consultant and passive house designer on your team just to help you pay attention to the details.
What is the difference between a good passive house designer and someone that's not so good? Or are they all good?
Okay. I think you can't describe people as a good passive house designer or
Why not?
a bad
Because
one.
physics is either spot on or not.
Well, but physics, it's simple. Like, it doesn't change. So in terms of passive house designers, they've gone through the training. So in a way, they should all be good because they should understand the physics of how a building works. And as I said, physics is not going to change no matter which country you're from or, where you're going. But in terms of experience, I think that a good passive house designer is somebody that has the experience, because physics, it's all good in practice, but then you also have to deliver it. So having done a few projects means that people have tried a few things, different construction methods, for example, worked with different builders and might have different ways to approach things and things like that. So I think the more experience you have, the better it gets.
What have you learned over time then, since you got that accreditation to where you are now? I know that you work for Enhabit, which are very clued up, particularly on retrofit, but also for new build, things like that. So how has it developed for you in this role?
I've learned a lot through, different range of projects, but I think the main thing is that passive house is a team sport. It's not something that somebody can achieve on their own. If you have a team, if there's only one person that wants it, which could be either the client or the passive house designer or somebody else, if the rest of the team hasn't bought in, it won't work. It's a team sport. Everybody needs to buy in. And when this is the case, then it becomes really easy because everybody sits at the table. And I think that the passive house designer will explain what concept and what targets we're trying to reach, and then ask every single person at the table, the structural engineer, the architect, and etc., what are their requirements, and see if they meet. And if they don't meet, then, start working and find a compromise. So I think that this aspect for me is the most crucial one. And I think it's one that I really enjoy as well, because you get so much collaboration and working with all types of different people with a lot of different backgrounds and different experiences. And I think that this is what makes it really enjoyable.
Do you find in the work that you do that you're working repeatedly with the same architects and so forth, or is it just next person, next person, next person?
It's a bit of both, because clients, if you start your journey, right, I'm pretty sure you probably did the same. You're like, I want to build a house. I'm going to talk to an architect. So generally, the architect is the first one at the table. And when that's the case and you have an architect and a client, then for us as passive house designers and building physics consultant, we get different teams every time. And it's okay, because we try something new with every single one of them. But at the same time, when we get clients that have done a bit of research and know that the low energy aspect will be the most important one, then they come to us before going to anybody else. And then we get the chance to actually work with the people we like working with. And so, we pick the team that goes nicely. You work with your friends and it all goes nice and easy, hopefully.
If we come to the passive house designer first, is there a risk that we're putting the architecture on the line here? When you say like working with particular people, do you want to push the architecture too, or is this all about numbers?
No, so you're right. So we have a lot different architects that we like to work with. But actually, as a client, when we have a client coming to us first, what we tend to provide them with is actually 2 or 3, even 4 different architects that we like working with, saying, this architect does a lot more of retrofit, kind of really traditional. This architect does a lot more in terms of new build and a bit of, different futuristic architecture and things like that. And so we get the client to pick which architects he would feel more comfortable working with, because it is about architecture first, but it's also actually about the person you're going to be working with, and you need a good interaction. So we let them pick that. So the architecture should never be compromised because of passive house.
Where should we find a passive house designer, or as you said, should we lead in on that architect first? Although, did you say that? You said the better ones come to you first.
The easy answer
I like easy answers, but I'll hear the difficult one too.
The easy answer is that you go onto the Passive House Institute website and every single accredited Passive House designer is listed there. So that's the easy answer. In terms of actually how it happens in practice, I feel that the Passive House world is a small community and people know about, each other. So I think as soon as people start reading about Passive House and obviously checking buildings, because that's what they're interested in, at the end of the day, you start reading about different companies and seeing what type of work they do. And these companies tends to have Passive House designers. And if they're engineers, then they will have a range of architects they've been working with, and vice versa, because you have Passive House designers that are architects, but they sometimes decide not, an architect has already more than enough to do on a job. So they might decide not to actually go down to the exact PHPP modeling or thermal bridging calculations and things like that. So they will have engineers that they're happy to work with. So I think as soon as you start looking a bit, then you'll have a few names popping up.
You've talked about PHPP and so forth. On a typical week, what are some of the tasks that you're doing? How are you splitting up your time?
That's a really good question. So I think it's actually really interesting because we don't have 2 days that are exactly the same. And I quite enjoy that. So as a Passive House designer, there's a few different tasks that I do, and any week will be a combination of these different tasks. So we do have, obviously, desk-based work, which is modeling. And this is mainly using PHPP for assessing how your building is going to perform. And you've got a few other tools as well, such as thermal bridging calculations or moisture transfer modeling and things like that. So these are the softwares that you will use on your own at your desk. But then you're also part of a team and you also work on projects. So you then have a part of your week that will be dedicated to client facing and, interaction and teamwork with the design team, structural engineer, QS, architect, and potentially the builders and everything else. And then you also have a really interesting part of your week, which is hopefully going on site, because it's nice doing design. But for me, I fail at my job if my design is not implemented on site, because at the end of the day, being a Passive House designer, it's about climate change and helping the planet, in addition, obviously, of low energy buildings and comfortable homes. But climate change is also behind all of this. And if my design is amazing, but not implemented on site, it's actually not that good. So being on site and supporting builders, and some of them might not have the experience. So giving them the tools of understanding the concept that we're asking for and making sure that your design is well implemented, and obviously checking the design, but also testing it. So that's where you've got all the airtightness testing and MVHR commissionings and things like that comes to mind. So making sure that we're there from A to Z, so that when we give the keys to the occupants, we're like, yes, I promise you, your building will work.
And what are you looking at when you're going to site? What are you actually checking visually, or is it just a chat, just to sort of sense whether something's going up wrong?
A bit of both. So making sure that your builders are comfortable with what they're supposed to do and that they're happy with the drawings and it all makes sense. But it's also, yes, you are checking, you are looking for things. And in terms of like typical things you would look at, obviously insulation plays a big part in low energy buildings. So you want to make sure that the insulation is very well installed, that you're not spotting any gaps or anything's missing. It's linked to thermal bridging, because a thermal bridge is your insulation not being continuous. So making sure that this doesn't happen, and in tricky areas where we had to compromise a bit, making sure that it's done properly. The next thing that comes to mind is also airtightness, because airtightness is very important. And yes, we do test it, but before testing it, we're installing all this airtightness layer with different materials, using a lot of tapes and things like that. So making sure that, the tapes are well done and adhere really well. And so, yeah, just making sure that everything is installed according to the design. And I think with teams that are not very experienced with Passive House yet, making sure that they step up their game a bit, because obviously Passive House it's about QA, right? It works so well because we have the quality assurance that it has been done the way it's supposed to be done. And that's why it works. That's why it delivers what it says on the tin. And if you look at how we build as an industry at the moment in the UK, we're doing okay, but we're not there yet in terms of attention to detail. So it's a matter of making sure everybody stepping up their game so that we get to deliver a really good building.
Maybe we can just finish up on a case study, something that's going through or gone through at Enhabit, where we've got a passive house designer. We obviously don't want to be repeating ourselves, but is there anything you can explain?
Yeah, so you start with the concept design. And on this case, it was a very particular case where the architect in question is also the owner. And throughout the course of getting his passive house building, and the building is on site at the moment, he's actually also done the passive house designer course. So that's been a really interesting one.
Does it help him as well?
Yeah, exactly.
I can see it.
He's done the course and I was like, oh, Marine, everything makes so much more sense. I'm so ready for this. But yeah, in terms of involvement, so because he was the architect and the owner at the same time, he and his wife came to us with, a concept design saying, this is what we're looking for. We want to do this with a main house, add a bit of an extension here, and they started approaching us with a concept design for architecture, but asking us for support in terms of what type of insulation strategy or things like that we should go for. So even before doing any modeling, we had quite a few meetings to discuss about strategy, to explain very quickly, for example, that on a retrofit, going with internal wall insulation tends to be a lot more difficult than external wall insulation for diverse reasons and things like this. So we help them before even starting modeling, discussing about the strategies that they would use. Then the next step is the feasibility study, which is, saying, okay, we might not have all the details, but we have an idea of what we're going to do with everything. If we put this into PHPP, does it work or does it not? And you make it work, obviously, because we need to achieve certification, but you fiddle around until you find the exact performance that you're looking for every single aspect of the build. And that normally gives you a kind of, performance specification that you want to achieve, which then lets you move to detailed design. And the point of detailed design is to meet every single performance that you've set yourself through every element. So if you said my wall needs to achieve a U value of about 0.15, you then need to go down to the detail, every single layer, every single material, so that you get an actual build-up that will go on site that reaches what you want. And so you refine and finalize all these elements before then going to site. And then they've been starting enjoying doing the design as well as doing the work. So at the moment, they're up on the roof putting some insulation and playing with air tightness tapes to see how it works in reality, how you deliver it.
You've seen a lot of projects, no doubt work with lots of self-builders. Is there anything that might help a potential client? Just a key piece of advice?
As a designer, my recommendation would be don't rush the design. If you want a low energy building, it will take a bit longer to design. It's okay. But I think that if people don't rush it for design and really get it right, I actually think that your build goes actually so much smoother, and it could potentially go quicker as well, because you don't have to sort things on site and things you haven't thought of or compromise on the target that you wanted, which is what happens when people don't actually work enough on the design before going to site when they're trying to reach low energy buildings. So yeah, that'd be that.
Marine, appreciate all of the information we've had today. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session. You'll find them at houseplanninghelp.com/142. You can review the key points, take a look at some photos of the retrofit that Marine mentioned. Also, we'll embed a video that shows some of the projects that they've worked on and explains how they work. They're probably one of the top companies in the UK when it comes to retrofit, but also new build. Links to Marine, to Enhabit as well. You'll find them all at houseplanninghelp.com/142. So can you relate here? Sometimes when you're trying to research building a house, there's just a lot of information to absorb, or maybe it's the choices that you're now engaging all this information. Maybe you're getting a bit overwhelmed, or perhaps it's this information you're looking at and you're just thinking, is this impartial? Are they trying to sell me something? Or maybe it's actually the steep learning curve makes you feel like you're the only person doing this or the first time anyone has ever built a house. So you're just feeling lonely in this process. Well, all of those to a degree are what I not only experience now, but have done in the past couple of years. And that's exactly why I set up the hub, to try and use the resources and the connections that I built up to the greater good and to try and just share some of this experience between us. I think that the reason self-build is such a small market in the UK is because it's so darn difficult. Also, we're hanging on the fact that at Regen Media, we create lots of videos. So we wanted to make it video heavy. And we've done that particularly with the Long Barrow case study in there. Very proud of this. Hope that we can go on to cover more case studies in the coming years. But the idea being that we're focusing on the decisions that are made rather than grand designs. We just show you, oh, here, they've run out of money. Let's focus on this story. How do they cope? This is very much about why did you make this choice? Why did you do that? Trying to get under the skin of what's actually going on. Even if we don't believe in the project that's taking place there, just understanding the decisions so that when we come to make them, hopefully we'll be far better off. And the modules are more about step-by-step process, so trying to help you do specific things is what we're after there. We've got our online forum, which is a closed Facebook group, private for our members to share their experiences, their perhaps photos on site or whatever it may be. And then we have our quarterly progress calls where we all get together, anyone who wants to hook onto the call, just to share where we're at in the process and try and jump over any hurdles. All of this, I still think it's a bargain, at £99 for the year. You can find out more details at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, it's a solo session. Why? Because I will be 40. Why haven't I built a house? Am I any better off than I was when I first started doing this podcast 4 years ago? Where have I gone wrong? What decisions would I wish I could take back and change? Where do I go from here? Do I just give up? Is that what happens? So lots to talk about next week. It's just me on my own, a few thoughts. Hopefully it will be useful to you. And I look forward to entering the next decade. Thank you so much for listening. It's always a pleasure to have you there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.